Hello, my name is Jewel. You don't need to know who I am, but you should know why I'm here. My grandpa, Stephen, is the author of a new exciting play called When the Break Happened in Orangeburg County. It's about our ancestors from when the break happened in 1865 until now. Many of my relatives are featured in the play, from my great 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 grandpa Stephen to my great grandpa Stephen to my grandpa Stephen. Guess what my uncle and cousin's name are? Stephen. Go to www.thebreakinorangeburg.com to learn more. An online store has been created to honor those relatives and other families with products featuring the Break logo. Go to www.thebreakstore.com to purchase items today and help to produce this play. Please.
Welcome to a new podcast show about stuff. It's the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. Here's you host, Stephen Davis.
Yes, this is Stephen Davis, and I am here to talk about stuff. Anyway, my first guest is a really dear friend, a journalist, a real estate broker, a writer, and she has just released, not too long ago, a fascinating book entitled American Runaway. It's a tome about her leaving the United States, her great home in Brooklyn, New York. Yay for Brooklyn. And then moving to Paris, France, because Trump was about to be inaugurated the next day. Welcome, Audrey. How you doing?
I am fine, Stephen. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being part of it.
My pleasure.
The first question I want to ask you is, as I said in introducing you, that you were a journalist, a real estate broker, a writer. Now, the two bookends go together, journalist and writer. Be a real estate broker.
I say one is a vocation. That's the journalist and writer. The other one is a passion. I just love real estate. I always have. As a kid, I always went to the home shows whenever they came to Tacoma once a year. I just like real estate. I like looking at property.
So every place you moved, you had a Monopoly set, huh?
No, I was terrible at Monopoly. Terrible. I never made any money.
I want to go first back to the glorious 1970s. And here you, high-profile job, long legs, and a Black woman. How did it feel? How did you navigate that?
Well, let me say, Stephen, of those three things, only two were correct in the 70s. I was a Black woman and I had long legs.
Okay.
I didn't achieve what I would call high profile probably until the early 80s. My first few years in New York, as they are for a lot of people coming to the city new, not a native New Yorker, were years of struggle, trying to get an apartment. That's one of the reasons I went into real estate. When I lived in Fort Greene, honey, let me tell you, it was drug infested. I lived down the street. I was on Hanson Place, down the street from a methadone center.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember Bickford's. It was a 24-hour restaurant. In 1973, I was painting my little dilapidated apartment, 2:00 in the morning to go to Bickford's. There were couples in the restaurant. Everybody stopped and glared at me, and I realized it was all the pimps and their women, and they thought I was an indie. I did become a broker, but I was not an independent hooker, ever. If you showed up at Bick at 2:00 in the morning, it wasn't because you were painting your bathroom and wanted to get breakfast. That was my reality. Yeah, so the early days of New York were days of struggle. But the thing about New York, and I'm sure you remember this, New York was really on the skids. The subways were just littered with graffiti. There was an oil shortage. There were gas lines with filling stations. City was about to go broke. But when you're young and stupid, you're not really affected. This is just life.
But it was fun.
Because you're young and stupid. And I will tell you something, Stephen, as a journalist, when NYABJ was just forming, those brothers who own Leviticus let us meet there upstairs for free, which was wonderful because it allowed us to get formed and off and running. And it was great to work with four brothers who had commercial space like that. That was not typical. in New York in the 70s. Four young brothers to have this space. They were making money, but they were also contributing to the community by allowing a group of Black journalists to use the facility as a meeting site, which I never forgot and we always appreciated.
Okay, then let's move to the 80s because I want to get to the
Mhm.
juicy parts. You being a high profile editor for Essence Magazine in New York, highly educated. It must have been heady times.
You know what? It was. It was. No, what I'm laughing about is that when Ed Lewis approached me first, he was the one who came to me. I was at Family Circle magazine, and he offered me the job of executive editor, and I turned him down because I was about to be made articles editor at Family Circle, which then was the biggest women's magazine in the world. And I thought I was going to be making history, and I didn't want to go, I wanted to make history. And it was a male friend, a Black male friend. We went out for drinks. I told him about the offer. I told him I had turned it down. And he said, he was also a journalist. He said, if you don't want that job, I do. I know how men think. And it was like, they're not going to hire him, but he thinks it's a good job. So maybe I should give this some more thought. And I accepted, and it was the best move I made. It was really the best. I always said, if you were a Black female journalist, there was no better place to be than Essence Magazine because it catered to the market that reflected me, Black women.
I owned in the 70s, I owned a advertising agency from the late 70s to the 80s. And
okay, I didn't know that.
One of the people that used to work for me, she was great friends with Susan Taylor. Susan Taylor used to come to my office to meet with Vicky.
Okay. Susan was wonderful to work for. She was wonderful, which is what made being at Essence for me the best move I'd made in my career, because she was affirming, she was smart, she surrounded herself with people that she trusted and valued in terms of what they were bringing. She had great ideas, very much a visionary, connected with readers, connected with the market, had her finger on the pulse of Black America in ways that were so important for the magazine. She started things like the men's issue, which was very popular. No publication was looking at the issues facing Black men. And that was very important for our audience because Black men and women, during that time, there was always supposedly this crisis in our relationships. And Essence really dealt with a lot of that. And we ended up having 25% of our readership were men, which was also unheard of.
I said, I remember, and I actually read Essence from time to time, not just because I was in the industry from the advertising standpoint, because I liked the articles. And then you got to learn about women.
Yes, a lot of men said that. After they admitted they looked at the magazine to see the women, said, oh yeah, I like looking at them fine women. And then they read the article.
It almost makes you think of what men always said about Playboy. Oh, I don't look at the pictures, I just read the articles.
Exactly. Yeah, Hugh Hefner was onto something too. Yeah.
We have a connection way before we met.
Oh, okay.
Years and years before we met. We were in the same space, Japan.
Oh, you call that right? On Facebook. Yeah.
We both were in the early 50s, Camp Zuma.
That's a camp that was in Yokohama? Was that in Yokohama?
Near there.
Because I never knew I didn't know the name of the camp we were in Yokohama. I just knew we were in Yokohama.
But those were some interesting days. And I want to talk about your parents as we get into the book, because that seems to be a very good foundation in terms of the book itself.
Yes, definitely.
I want to show my audience, but I guess I don't.
Oh, my parents, but there's applications are covering part of it.
I had not intended on showing that yet. I was looking for the cover of your book, and I didn't pull it up as well. Here is a copy of the book that you wrote. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, it's called American Runaway.
Right. And, black and, but the rest of it, Black and Free in Paris in the Trump years. That's very important.
Okay, let's get to that in terms of why you did write the book.
I've said this in other interviews. I did not go to Paris. I left America when Trump got elected. I knew if he got in, I didn't want to be here. I didn't think he was going to get in. So that was surprising that I ended up leaving because he did get elected. But I didn't think I was going to write a book. I didn't go there expecting to write a book. I went thinking I was only going to be there for the first 100 days of his presidency because I just knew in that time, everyone would see how inept he was and get rid of him. So that was very naive on my part. Once I understood that he was in fact going to be there, that is when it occurred to me that I could write a book. What happened, I had done a piece for the Huffington Post on leaving, and it got so much reaction. It got 14,000 hits. And I said, maybe there's a larger work here, looking at the phenomenon of leaving the country, looking at Trump as the impetus for that, and then looking at Paris, which I think, from my perspective, was a great place for Black Americans to be. And there was a history of Black Americans going to Paris in particular to flee American racism. So
that's something I want to talk about. I have that in mind to talk about, but I want to first talk about your parents. In your book, particularly within your book, you have a very interesting story that I want you to talk about.
About my mother?
Yes.
My mother actually was in Paris long before I was even conceived. She was in the military. She was a WAC. She was in the Black WAC unit that was deployed to Europe during World War II. And she was in the 6888 Postal Battalion. And these women were charged with sorting mail and getting the mail distributed to the American forces during the war. After the war, my mother was still stationed in Europe, and she, in Birmingham, England, she went to hear Charles de Gaulle speak. He was the great hero of the war, General Charles de Gaulle. Even when France surrendered to the Germans, I believe in 1941, he refused to capitulate. So the French resistance were the forces that he led. So after the war, he was a huge hero. My mother went to hear him speak. And my mother has always been a character. She was 28 years old, and she's way in the back, and she decided she wanted to get up front. So she takes out her military ID and starts waving it and says, "Press coming through." So everybody parted to let this tall woman come through. And one of the gendarmes, one of de Gaulle's security people, saw her, and he looked at the whatever she was waving, and he said that did not look like a press pass. So he went up to her. By now she's in the front of the crowd, and he asked her to step out and show him the press pass, which was her military ID. So she was busted immediately. But he was so impressed with her chutzpah that he took her up on stage and sat her. This is so typical of my mother. Oh my God. Here she is sitting on stage when Charles de Gaulle comes to speak. And there was a newsreel footage of this, and every weekend in those days, you'd go to the movies on the weekend and you would always see the newsreel of what had happened, newsworthy. And they showed de Gaulle's speech every Saturday. So she would take her girlfriends and wait for the newsreel and go, "There I am, there I am." And I just loved hearing that story growing up because it's so typical of my mother. She never changed.
You got a lot of her genes in you.
I've only recently acknowledged that. At her 80th birthday, she had this young friend from her church, very attractive man, and he was sitting at the head table with the family. And she's giving a speech. Well, she introduces him as her boyfriend. This guy was like 40. So she's standing up and she says, "Yes, brother Lonnie is my boyfriend. He's my man. We go out for lunch, and this is my boyfriend." And she said, "But I just don't understand. Everywhere he goes, he brings this woman who's his wife." So everybody just roared. And then she points to the woman sitting next to him, who is his wife. And she was like that. She was just a cut up. She was just really a cut up. But it's great to have, I realized, again, both of my parents are gone. It was great to have a mother who had a wonderful sense of humor, because a lot of people don't have a sense of humor. And to have a mother who did just gave your life a little different twist because she could see the humor and stuff. And believe when we know as Black folks, sometimes you got to work long and hard to see humor in anything.
This is
But
true. This is true. But
I,
one of the things I will say that within the book, in reading the book, my thought immediately was sometimes when writers write, they write because they can write whatever they want to write and will put whatever feeling they want to put into the book. And sometimes they make themselves a third person far removed. But in this book, it's you. When I'm reading, I said, if I wouldn't have known you were written it, I would have said, boy, this sounds just like Audrey.
You know what, Stephen? So many people have said that, and it's taken me, I still don't understand that, but and men have said that more than women, which I find interesting. And my brother explained it to me because he said, I can hear you talking. I can hear you talking. I don't know what to say. When I'm writing, it's a process. I work on the craft. I work on the style. So I'm happy that people think that style matches their perception of me. I guess that's a good thing, but it's an unconscious thing. I was just surprised when people kept saying that.
The book is so much about you. It's a personalized book about your experience.
Right. It's a memoir. It's a memoir.
So people who know you, that's how they remember you.
Right.
You know, That's a good thing. You still have the ability to make yourself not as personal in your writings, but a particular book. That's what it came over to me.
The book has a lot of history and politics, which I also am proud of. And I have to say, you gave me some information that I used in the book. And it's when you do a book like this, at least for me, you get bits of information from everyone if you're listening. And you gave me some background on Houphouët-Boigny, Felix, who had been a long-running president of the Ivory Coast.
Yeah.
And even though Essence had gone to the Ivory Coast in 1984 and done a story on the country, you told me that he had been a minister in the French government when Côte d'Ivoire was under French rule, which I didn't know. And that was really a very valuable nugget of history that I used in the book. And those yours is the only one I can think of right away where I got information that really I thought made the book richer, because when you can get in those kind of details, it just illuminates whatever story you're telling. And when you told me that, it's like, oh, no wonder. Not only was he elected president, he served for a long time and he had ties to the French that Essence talked about, but there was never an historical context for why that happened. And I want to thank you for that. That was very.
Wow, I'm. You never know what you say to a person that might be turned into a gem.
Exactly. That's very true. That's very true. And I know that as a journalist. So I appreciated that. But the book was fun to do.
I got the feeling as I'm reading the book that leaving America, and I think that you probably said it somewhat at the very beginning, that leaving America because of Trump was a great hook, but it is the history and the fact that racism in one country might not be racism in another country. And there's degrees of racism. That I wanted to ask you, am I on the right thinking of what you were writing about in terms of the racism?
Yes. One of the things that I think America suffers from, Black and all Americans, is the whole race gestalt. We as a nation are consumed with race. And I'm pretty sure we don't realize that. And we really don't realize that if we never venture out of America. And one of the things that's clear to me in other countries, there's just not the preoccupation with race. And it can weigh us down, and it weighs down everybody. I don't mean just Black folk, white folk. Everything is discussed and compared and looked at in terms of race. And that's really debilitating. It really keeps you from, I think, moving on with other things, with being productive in other kind of ways. And it's unfortunate, but it's America's, I don't want to say failing. I think racism is its failing, but one of the products of racism is this constant obsession with race. And it's in everything. How many Black folk get COVID compared to white folk? Who's getting vaccinated? Who's not? Who gets married? Who's in prison? Who owns a home? All of these things are looked at racially. That doesn't happen. I can't speak to other countries. That does not happen in France, man. That does not happen in France. And they have as multicultural a population as we do. They have a very diverse population, and there is not this total obsessive reporting by race. That's a real American phenomenon. And
what is the solution to that here in America?
You know what, Stephen? I don't know if there is one because it's so in the fabric of America. And it goes back to our history. It goes back to our slave history. Anytime you have a population of people who for 400 years worked for free, simply based on the color of their skin, and were treated inhumanly, were treated as beasts of burden, were hated, that's still with us in terms of the hatred, in terms of how whites see us, how we see them. And I just concluded one of the real thing at the heart of race in America, we don't like each other. Black people don't like, white people don't like Black people. We really don't, for all kinds of reasons, for all kinds of history. Bottom line, we don't like each other. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have individual friends. We look at people separate and apart from their race, but overall, the two races are constantly in conflict based on the history. And the history you can't change. See, the history you can't change. And there's nothing in white American behavior that makes me think they really want to change because they've benefited. If you've benefited from a system, why would you want to change it?
I look at this whole riot thing on the Capitol, and it became clear, particularly as of this taping, Trump is in the middle of an impeachment hearing, and you have them releasing video, powerful video, but once it's released and certain ones feel, well, yeah, I'm sorry for that, but I'm not going to impeach him for doing anything. Now, this show theme is progress despite obstacles. So I'm not going to dwell particularly on Trump and all of that in coming episodes, but I will say that had that been a group of Blacks, those 250,000 that marched on Washington in 1963, had they turned around and went to the White House, they would have bombed them.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And the other point that I wanted to make in terms of what you're saying is that in my writings on a particular subject, you saw where after the slaves became free, white folks who owned them told them, no, you cannot live around us. You have to go and do your own separate thing. And then when this separate thing became successful, they said, no, you're not supposed to move away and become successful. You're supposed to have to always rely on me.
I think, see, that to me gets to the heart of what makes American racism schizophrenic, an irrational impulse and insane. American racism is a form of insanity. And until you can acknowledge a mental disorder within your system, you're never going to be able to heal it. And I just think American racism has always been an insane response to the history, to the people. The fact that you sitting there in your beautiful royal blue, what looks like a dashiki, and
I just got it.
It's great. It's beautiful.
It came from Africa.
Yes.
Somebody sent it to
beautiful.
Me from Africa.
It's very nice.
When I opened it up this morning, I said, this is what I'm going to wear.
No, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. But the fact that you as a Black man being proud in your African dashiki are a threat to a white man simply because of the fact you exist is insane. But it to me has also always spoken to the power that we as a people must give off to these other people. Otherwise, why are you so frightened? What is so upsetting to you? What is so disturbing about my presence, your presence? What is it that bothers you? because clearly you're bothered.
It's true.
And it speaks to our power. I've always, when I would speak to young people, when I was editor at Essence in particular, I would always tell the Middle Passage story, which always got projected as, oh my God, these people in the hull of slave boats and they're dying and they're throwing up and rolling in their own feces. I would always say anybody who survived that is superior. They are superior physically, they're superior mentally, they are superior emotionally. And then I would say, we are descendants of those people. And those people, to me, were the chosen people. How do you separate those who made it over and those who are at the bottom of the ocean? And one of the things I've always felt we've had to do is change the narrative around us. Because if you look, when you talk about 1619, 400 years when that ship first landed, those people who walked off that ship were superior people. They had to be. They had to be. You didn't survive that because you were lucky. You didn't survive that because you were light-skinned. You didn't survive that because your daddy knew somebody. That was strictly the survival of the fittest, pure and simple, right down to their basics. Those people were superior. So when I would tell that, it was always an empowering moment for kids because I could tell by the reactions. And those are the kind of narrative that I think we need to transmit to our children, to other people. We need to understand who we are. The fact that we are still here, not only just here, but we are successfully still here. We are thriving in some ways. And we got a lot of stuff to do, and we have a lot of crap that we still go through. But when you look at those who have made it, and I don't even mean made it economically, and there are plenty of those, but just are here, halfway healthy. The fact that we could launch a movement and not fire a gun, not have a taser, not storm the Capitol. We did it nonviolently, we did it with dignity, and we changed our history. We need to understand that.
One of the things that, in response to something that you had said earlier, my feeling is that, yes, both sides might hate each other, but the difference is, just like you were talking earlier about the degrees of racism, there's degrees of hate. Our hate is based on you stepping on my neck.
Yes, yes.
They're on what you look like, only the color of your skin.
Exactly.
That determining factor. And that is a hard thing to change. It has taken a long time to do so. But one of the other things that I did was I did write a play about my ancestors. And it was to say to those that are here now, you are only here now because of what you said. But your ancestors came out of the Middle Passage. They were strong enough to survive to be able to let you live.
Right. Let you be born.
So what is your next project?
Well, that's a good question, Stephen. There's a part of me that just wants to retire, but I know I get bored doing that in 2 weeks. I want to go back to Paris. I want to go promote the book in Paris. It's done well in Paris, and I have a community in Paris. And I need Paris because sometimes I get so weighted down by race here that I need to just go somewhere that's better for my head. Not to say that France is perfect, no place is perfect, but the race piece is just not what it is here. So my next project is get back to Paris. I'm in talks with a political figure about doing that biography. We'll see how it goes. I'm not really talking a lot about it yet. I need to see how I feel about even doing it. And not that I don't think the subject is great, I do. And I think it's really important that our stories get told, whether it's me doing Ed Lewis's book or my book, whether you doing your family. All of those stories are so important because that's what's going to change history for us. Whether or not white folk get it, I don't really care about, but it's important that we get it as a people and understand.
And that's a great point in terms of why within even the Black community, especially, theaters and performing places need to be funded and stuff because
Absolutely.
the ideas of change come from those particular places. We only think about it in terms of entertainment standpoint, but it is a dissemination of knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, and the arts are so important for that, for us in particular. Yeah, yeah, the arts are critical because that's how we, as a mass of people, absorb information. You go to see a play and you learn. You go and see Raisin in the Sun and you learn something about segregation and racism in Chicago, but you can extrapolate it into all of America. So it's important that the arts continue to tell our story because that's how we get the information.
One time I was at Sylvia's, as a matter of fact, in Harlem, a landmark restaurant. This was after a performance that Woody King Jr. had in Harlem on 124th Street, and Ruby Dee was part of the broadcast, and some other folks were part of the broadcast. But after we went to Sylvia's, Woody, Douglas Ward, Turner Ward, Amari Baraka, and Cliff Frazier. It was so wonderful talking with them and listening to their stories and pointing, because you mentioned Raisin in the Sun, of talking to folks that were in the room that used to party with Lorraine. And I'm just sitting there, just soaking up this story. So whenever I have Woody on this podcast, we're going to talk about that. And it's going to happen. Actually, I tape him tomorrow.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I'm the first one you've taped for your podcast?
Yeah, you're the very first one.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored. I'm honored.
What happened is that I have a lot of relatives. I send out every morning music during this pandemic to help.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It was initially for my children, but I send it out to, I have a number of people that I send it out to. And they all keep saying, you should do a podcast. You should do a podcast. I had to think long and hard to something that you just said. Do I want to be committed for doing something every week?
Yeah.
I'm old and lazy now.
That's a good term. I'm going to use that, honey. That's how I feel. I'm old and lazy. And see, I've always been a little lazy, but when you add old to it, shoot, honey, if I get up, that's an accomplishment.
As I usually say, my usual phrase is old.
There you go. There you go. But okay, Stephen, my newest thing about age, because people really get upset when I say I'm old, because I don't have a problem with that. I just say you shouldn't look old or act old. Being old is fine. It's fine because it means you made it. It means you made it. But you don't want to look old, meaning, and you don't want to act old, meaning, but being old, that's a triumph. I think that, especially for Black folk,
But you know, sometimes it's good to act old because you get discounts. I didn't join AARP initially because my mother was a member. And I always said, I'm not going to be on the same old organization that my mother is. And then they start saying, well, you can get this discount and that discount. Okay.
Let me tell you something. I passed for being older just so I could get into the movies discounted. Because I think I guess you had to be 55 or something. Anyway, when I turned 50, I was asking for the senior discount.
And hoping that they wouldn't ask you for your
and people did that. I had another friend who said he was in the same age group. And he said, go ahead and show the ID because these young people can't count. They can't count. So if the numbers are way back, they really can't count.
Audrey, this has been a wonderful conversation. And I so much thank you for being the very first person that I've interviewed.
I'm honored.
I thought about whether I should put you in Black History Month or Women's Month. And I went back and forth, and I decided I needed a good lead off for Women's Month.
Okay. I'm fine with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I do appreciate that so much, and you just have a wonderful day, and hopefully we'll get together again after this pandemic. You have a wonderful day, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
That was a wonderful show. Don't you think so? I want you to look for this podcast on an ongoing basis because we're going to have such wonderful time and wonderful shows. So you have a good week and we will see you again next week. I thank you so much for being here and bye.
Thank you for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed this show about stuff. See you next time.
Oh, my name is Jewel. You don't need to know who I am, but you should know why I'm here. My grandpa, Stephen, is the author of a new exciting play called When the Break Happened in Orangeburg County. It's about our ancestors from when the break happened in 1865 until now. Many of my relatives are featured in the play, from my great-great-great-grandpa Stephen to my great-grandpa Stephen to my grandpa Stephen. Guess what my uncle and cousin's name are? Stephen. Go to www.thebreakinorangeburg.com to learn more. An online store has been created to honor those relatives and other families with products featuring the Break logo. Go to www.thebreakstore.com to purchase items today and help to produce this play. Please.